The vertical beam. Jesus says to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But if the vertical beam is just about the vertical beam, guess what happens? There's infighting and the church is impotent. But the horizontal beam is a different beam on the cross. In fact, there are some churches that get the horizontal beam right. Remember where it says to love your neighbor as yourself? There are some churches that's what they're all about. In fact, it's a social gospel. It's all about this and that and how we're going to affect this and how we're going to, in fact, they become a political action committee. In fact, the only time they gather together is whether or not they're going to vote or they're going to march or they're going to go to the city council meeting and demand their agenda. And that horizontal beam is intact. They got it going on. But they rarely tell anybody about how to get reconciled with God. And is equally impotent as the church that has the vertical beam only. The horizontal beam is of no consequence to the community in which they find themselves in. Politicians listen to them only because they're the squeakiest wheel in the house. But they have little or no regard for the God that they serve. The point that I'm trying to make in the moments that I have left here is if we don't have the vertical beam and the horizontal beam together, if we don't focus on the nexus point where they come together, which is where Jesus died, bled, and was rose again for our salvation, if we don't focus on the totality of the cross, then we will not have a maximum influence. And in fact, Jesus put it this way, if salt loses its saltiness, what good is it but to be trampled underfoot of men? And that's what's happening today. The church has no influence. Those in leadership could care less what you think because you believe that you don't have any influence. We're afraid to say anything because it's not politically correct. And I'm trying to figure out who came up with that term politically correct. And I dare say the person who came up with politically correct was trying to make you impotent in the values that God has called you and I to live by and to encourage others to live by as well. Jesus is saying, don't let your light shine under a bushel. Don't let your light shine just within the walls of the church. Don't be silent on these moral issues, which everybody knows is right, has to be right. The reason why it has to be right is because it's thousands of years of evidence. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years of evidence. We wipe out the 10 Commandments off the walls of our judicial courthouses. As last night, anybody in here ever watched this show on TV called Duck Dynasty? Raise your hand if you watched that thing. Some of you have. Guys got big beards. Well, last night I heard online Phil Robertson, the Duck Commander. He was preaching at Saddleback Church last night. And I was watching it online. And he got in talking about the 10 Commandments, how we wipe out the 10 Commandments, and yet every time we break the 10 Commandments, guess where it takes us? If you break the 10 Commandments, if thou shalt not murder and you murder somebody, guess where it takes you? It takes you to the courthouse. Yet you took it off the courthouse walls. And if you just break it, if you lie, guess where you do? You go to the courthouse because you're confronted with this thing. If you steal, where do you go? You go to the courthouse. Thou shalt not covet. Well, if you can't curb your own appetite and you get yourself out around and you got to declare bankruptcy, where do you go? You go to the courthouse. And he's saying, why do we take it off the courthouse walls when you're only going to come back and hit the courthouse after you break it? And I thought, that's pretty smart thinking right there. But why are we content as Christ followers to be down here with our light burning? Yes, we know Christ and we love Jesus, but that's not what Jesus is asking us to do. He's asking us to take the lampshade off and maximize our influence by rubbing shoulders next to people who need that influence. So I want to challenge you. In the days and weeks ahead, I'm going to ask you to pray. God, how can I maximize my influence? Surely I want you to volunteer here at Hilltop and serve in whatever capacity that God lays on your heart. There are many ministries that are going on, many of them focused outwardly, reaching kids and teenagers especially. Because if we don't pass these values on to a next generation, guess what's happened to that generation? It just goes farther and farther and farther into darkness. But I want to challenge you. I want to call you to pray and ask God, how should I spend my time, my talents, and my treasures to be influential in the community at large? Just because somebody says it's politically incorrect doesn't mean it's incorrect. In fact, the best way to love somebody is to tell them the truth in love. Even perfect strangers. In a loving, kind way, say, this is a standard that God's put out, and it's been this way for thousands of years, and you know what? It's worked. It's worked.